The automatic doors slid open, letting in the sharp smell of disinfectant and warm air from the lobby. I wiped my shoes on the mat and steadied myself, feeling the familiar stiffness in my hip from last year's surgery. It was supposed to be a simple visit, nothing more than checking on my room and talking with the staff. Before I reached the hallway, the care home supervisor stepped out from behind the desk and raised her hand in a quiet stop. Her eyes were tight, not panicked, but concerned in a way that made my stomach drop. She leaned in just enough for only me to hear. "Don't enter that room alone." I looked at her face for a moment, waiting for some kind of explanation, but she barely took a breath before adding, "Your nephew was here earlier." The way she said it, soft, careful, sent a cold ripple through me. My nephew almost never came by. When he did, it was usually because he needed something. The fact that he'd shown up without warning didn't fit anything I knew about him or his habits. I felt a slow unease forming under my ribs. "What did he want?" I asked. But she didn't answer right away. Instead, she shifted her weight and glanced down the hallway toward my room, as if something there didn't sit right with her. "He was asking questions," she said finally. "Specific ones." She paused there, leaving enough space between her words to make their weight sink deeper. He didn't say much about why. Her expression tightened again, and she lowered her voice. "He wasn't himself." I nodded, trying to keep my face steady. I'd learned over the years not to show too much, especially after losing my wife and going through months of health problems. Caution became second nature. Even simple things required planning now. Medication schedules, blood tests, follow-up visits. I didn't have the energy for surprises, and my nephew was nothing if not a walking surprise whenever money or paperwork was involved. I walked slowly toward my room, feeling the carpet soften under my step, each footfall landing heavier than I expected. The lights in the hallway flickered once overhead, not dramatically, just enough to make the air feel different. When I reached the door, I saw it wasn't fully closed. It hung slightly open, the hinge catching the light like someone had tried to shut it quietly, but hadn't bothered to finish the job. The room inside was dark, not dim, dark. The switch on the outside panel hadn't been touched. I stood there for a moment, letting the supervisor's warning settle in. My nephew never cared enough to stop by for company. The last time he visited, he spent more time looking at my medication chart than at me. He had asked innocent questions, the kind that looked harmless on paper, but didn't feel harmless when spoken out loud. Today felt no different, only sharper. The supervisor walked up behind me, staying a respectful distance away. She didn't repeat her warning, but the tension in her posture told me she didn't need to. I placed my hand on the door frame and leaned slightly forward, listening for any sound inside. Nothing, just the low hum of the air conditioner down the hall. "I'll step in with you," she offered softly. It wasn't fear, it was caution, the kind that comes from seeing more than she was willing to say. I nodded once, grateful without showing it. Together we pushed the door open, moving slowly, our steps careful on the floor. The darkness inside held still, waiting. Whatever my nephew had been doing here earlier, it wasn't kindness. That much I could already feel. The supervisor flicked on the lights, and the room settled into its usual stillness, but something in me didn't. I stood near the foot of the bed and let my eyes move over the space, grounding myself before the old memories rose again. My nephew hadn't always been a source of worry. Years ago, after my brother died, the boy spent a few months with me while his mother got back on her feet. He was quiet then, polite, carrying grief in a way only children do. Silent, heavy, obedient, because he didn't know what else to be. I helped him with schoolwork, taught him how to tie a tie, packed his lunch every morning. I thought those months meant something. Maybe they did to me. As an adult, he drifted into a different orbit. He showed up at my door only when he needed assistance. Never for dinner, never for conversation. The pattern grew clearer over the years. His visits tightened around tax season, medical bills, or talk about inheritances in the family. He'd ask simple questions that didn't feel simple. "You still have that savings account, right?" Or, "Who handles the payments for your health stuff?" If I redirected the conversation, he simply waited and asked the same question another day. I still remember one afternoon when he stopped by unannounced, stepping into my living room with a stack of papers. "It's future planning," he had said, as if planning required no explanation. He tried to walk me through them fast, pointing at signature lines and skimmed paragraphs. I didn't sign anything. The moment felt wrong then, and now it felt like a thread leading directly to today. As we checked the room, A caregiver passed by and offered a soft hello before stopping beside us. She mentioned casually that the last time my nephew visited was months ago. He didn't stay long, she said, just asked a few questions and left. Her tone wasn't accusing, just observant, but I felt the air tighten around the world. My nephew didn't visit without purpose. He certainly didn't show up twice in a year for affection. I walked to the small dresser near the window and rested my hand on it. My reflection in the glass was faint, but enough to remind me of the truth. An older man, widowed, moving slower these days, more careful with each step. I'd been working through a cycle of health issues, blood pressure, heart monitoring, medication changes. Everything required paperwork. Everything required someone paying attention. And someone had been paying attention for reasons I wasn't meant to notice. A memory surfaced, sharp around the edges. Last winter, my nephew had called me out of nowhere. His tone had been strangely upbeat, almost rehearsed. After a short conversation, he slipped in one line that didn't match anything else he said. "You won't need that place much longer, Uncle." I brushed it off at the time, thinking he was trying, and failing, to be hopeful about my recovery. Now, standing in my dimly lit room with the supervisor watching me carefully, the sentence carried a weight I couldn't ignore. My nephew wasn't a villain in some dramatic story. He was something far more dangerous, someone who knew my history, my routines, my vulnerabilities, and believed they were his to navigate. The past didn't paint him as a monster, but it did draw a map. Each memory, each question, each unexpected visit fit into a line that pointed directly here. I ran my thumb along the edge of the dresser, grounding myself again. Whatever had brought him here earlier wasn't kindness or nostalgia. It was intent, quiet, deliberate, and aimed at something he didn't want me to see. We stepped farther into the room, and at first glance, nothing appeared touched. The blankets were folded the way I left them. The chair sat in its usual place, and the small table beside the bed looked unchanged. But the longer I stood there, the clearer the differences became. One drawer on the dresser was pulled out just enough to break the quiet symmetry of the room. The papers I kept in the top tray were no longer aligned. The edges were uneven, shifted slightly as if someone had rifled through them with careful fingers. It wasn't a mess. It was the kind of disturbance made by someone trying not to leave one. The caregiver who'd passed us earlier stepped inside, wiping her hands on a cloth. She waited until the supervisor moved toward the window before speaking to me directly. "He asked about your insurance," she said softly, "and your emergency contacts." She glanced toward the hall, making sure no one else was listening. "He also wanted to know who your legal next of kin is." Her tone wasn't dramatic, just honest. That honesty made the unease settle deeper in my chest. I walked over to the small shelf where I kept my medication printouts. I always left the weekly schedule in the same spot, folded neatly so the nurse could check it at a glance. The space was empty. The paper wasn't on the shelf, the bed, or the top drawer. I checked again, slower this time, running my hand along the wood as if it might be tucked behind something. It wasn't. I straightened up, the missing sheet leaving a cold line of concern down my spine. It wasn't valuable. It wasn't something anyone should care about, unless they had a reason to. My phone buzzed in my pocket, drawing my attention for a moment. I stepped to the side and glanced at the screen. A message from my nephew, sent earlier that morning. "Hope you're feeling better today, Uncle. Thinking of you." The words were warm, almost gentle. They didn't belong to the same man who rarely called, rarely checked in, and never used that tone unless he wanted to soften a request that would follow. The text sat on my phone like something wearing the wrong face. 2 days ago, he'd told me he couldn't visit for weeks. Too much going on. Too many obligations. He'd said it casually, with that distant tone he always used when pushing responsibility away. And yet now, here he was, showing up unannounced, leaving questions behind him like footprints. The contradiction wasn't small. It was deliberate or careless in a way that meant he didn't think I would notice. But I noticed. I always did. I walked to the chair near the window and sat down slowly, letting the staff talk quietly near the doorway. My mind moved through each detail like steps on a narrow path. The open drawer, the rearranged papers, the missing schedule, his sudden visit, his warm message, his claim that he was too busy to come for weeks. Every piece pressed against the others, creating a shape I didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. I reached for the notebook I kept in my coat pocket. It wasn't for dramatic reason. It was practical. Years of managing my health had taught me to track things carefully. I opened it to a blank page and wrote a simple date at the top. Then I listed each detail, one by one, in short words that left no room for interpretation. No opinions, no guesses, just facts. When I finished, I closed the notebook and slid it back into my pocket. I didn't say anything to the staff. I didn't ask more questions. This wasn't the moment for confrontation, and too much attention could make him aware that I understood something was wrong. Instead, I stood, adjusted the edge of the blanket on the bed, and took a slow breath. The room looked normal again, but the quiet held a different meaning now. It wasn't safety. It was a warning. Whatever my nephew had come here for, he wasn't finished, and neither was I. I waited until after lunch, when the hallway noise thinned and most residents rested, before making the call. I sat at the edge of my bed, keeping my voice low as I dialed the number printed on my insurance card. The representative answered with a practiced tone, and I asked if she could confirm that my account was secure. She asked a few verification questions, then paused for a moment, longer than usual. "There was an inquiry recently," she said. "Someone who identified themselves as family." The word sat between us with a weight I couldn't ignore. I asked what the inquiry was about. The representative explained that the caller had requested details on my beneficiary options and asked whether changes could be made without a physical signature. My fingers tightened around the phone. I kept my tone steady and thanked her for the information. She reminded me that all modifications required explicit approval and a clear identity match. I ended the call and stared at the silent room, letting the facts settle into place, one by one. A soft knock came at the door, and the supervisor stepped inside. She held a clipboard but didn't look at it. "I forgot to mention something this morning," she said. "Your nephew tried to go behind the desk." Her eyes shifted toward the hallway. "He said he needed to double-check your records. We told him that area is for staff only, and he backed off, but he was persistent." Her hesitation was brief, but enough to confirm the unease growing inside me. She didn't need to say more. After she left, I pulled out my phone and checked my banking app. I wasn't looking for missing money, just activity. A notification popped up on the screen. "Unrecognized login attempt detected last night." The timestamp matched the hours when I was asleep. The system had blocked the attempt, but the warning alone was enough. It didn't list who tried. It didn't need to. I stood and moved slowly around the room, checking each place with deliberate care. The drawer, the shelf, the small box where I kept personal items from home. Nothing seemed out of order at first, but I'd learned that the smallest change often carried the most meaning. When I opened the bedside table, I felt a hollow space where something familiar should have been. The framed photo of my late wife, one I kept close, more for comfort than sentimentality, was gone. I checked the floor, the dresser, even under the bed, knowing none of those places made sense. The photo wasn't anywhere. Someone had taken it, not in anger, not in haste, but quietly, deliberately. A missing medication printout was one thing. A missing photograph was something different. A person doesn't take a picture unless they need it for something. I sat down again, slower this time, and let my breathing settle. The facts lined up in front of me like steps on a long hallway. He asked about insurance. He asked about next of kin. He went through my drawers. He tried to see my medical chart. He logged into an account he had no right to touch. And now a photo, an object with no value except emotional, was gone. He wasn't visiting out of concern. He was collecting pieces, pulling information from every possible corner, learning how my life fit together and how it could be altered. I didn't feel anger yet. I felt something quieter, something sharper. The kind of clarity that comes after days of small details finally folding into one clear shape. Whatever he wanted, it wasn't my well-being. It was something tied to my identity, my records, my future. I picked up my notebook, flipped to the same page I'd started earlier, and added new lines. No reactions, no theories, just facts. When I finished writing, I closed it and placed it back in my coat pocket. I wasn't collapsing under the weight of this. I was preparing for whatever came next. A little before dinner, one of the younger staff members knocked on my door. She held a folded sheet of paper in her hand, gripping it like something she wasn't sure she should be touching. "This was left at the front desk," she said. "Your nephew dropped it. He said it was for you, but he left before we could catch him." Her voice was soft, unsure. I took the page and thanked her, keeping my expression steady until she stepped out. When I unfolded it, the air in the room seemed to tighten. It was a life insurance change request. My name at the top, my policy number beneath, all laid out in clean printed lines. At the bottom sat a signature meant to be mine. The strokes looked close to my handwriting, but the weight was wrong, the angle too stiff, the pen pressure uneven. It didn't take expertise to see it wasn't mine. It took only familiarity, decades of signing my own name, dozens of forms in hospitals, banks, and offices. This was an imitation wearing confidence it hadn't earned. I looked at the effective date printed near the center of the page. Yesterday. He hadn't waited weeks or days. He had already moved. The shock didn't hit as panic. It hit as a cold understanding that the line between suspicion and proof had finally snapped into place. I folded the page slowly and slid it under the blanket on my lap before standing. When I opened the door, the same staff member was still nearby, collecting trays. She paused when she saw me. "There's something else," she said, lowering her voice. "When he was here, he asked one of the nurses about your overnight vitals and your reactions to medication changes." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It wasn't casual. It felt like he had a reason. I didn't react outwardly, but the words landed hard. Overnight vitals weren't something the average visitor cared about. Most people asked about appetite or mobility. Only someone with intent asked what could go wrong in the dark hours, when blood pressure dropped and medication worked its strongest. Suddenly, the missing medication schedule and the missing photograph weren't random pieces. They were part of something deliberate. I thanked her for letting me know. When she walked away, her footsteps faded quickly, leaving me in a silence that wasn't empty. It was aware. The realization took shape without dramatics, without raised voices. My nephew wasn't just trying to access my accounts or pressure me into paperwork. He was positioning himself to benefit from an incident, something that could be explained as natural, something that might go unquestioned if the timing was right and the evidence was vague. I returned to my room and shut the door fully, turning the lock with quiet precision. I pulled the paper from beneath the blanket and examined it. Again, this time tracing the forged signature with the edge of my thumb. My name, rewritten by someone else's hand, under a document that would have shifted every financial path tied to me. And him listed clearly, unapologetically, as the primary beneficiary. There was no guessing now. No giving the benefit of the doubt. No soft explanations left to reach for. Whatever he had come here for earlier wasn't curiosity. It was planning. I folded the form tightly and slid it into the lining of my jacket, placing it between two layers of fabric so it wouldn't bend. Evidence needed to be preserved, not displayed. I smoothed the jacket and sat down, letting the weight of the moment settle without swallowing me. I knew what this paper meant, and I knew what it warned me about. He wasn't waiting for my approval. He was waiting for an opportunity. The next morning, I called my doctor before breakfast. I kept my tone steady, telling him only that a few things in my room had been disturbed and that a relative had asked questions about my medication. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a long silence on his end, the kind that lets you know someone is thinking through possibilities they don't want to say out loud. "Let's review your prescriptions," he said finally. His voice carried a new edge. "One of them can cause complications if taken incorrectly. I want you to be very careful with your dosages for now." He pulled up my chart and read through each medication. When he reached the heart-related one, he paused again. "This is the one I'm concerned about," he said. "If someone increased the dose without you noticing, it could lower your pressure too far." He didn't say the rest. He didn't need to. I thanked him for the warning, and he told me he would send updated instructions to the care home nurse so she could monitor things more closely. Not long after the call, the supervisor knocked on my door with a detective beside her. He introduced himself with the calm tone of someone who had walked into situations like this more times than he wanted to. He carried a small binder and a pen, and his eyes moved around the room slowly, taking in details without making assumptions. The supervisor explained that she had reported my nephew's behavior after seeing the forged form tucked inside the folder I handed her for safekeeping. I gave the detective the document, and he studied it with that same measured care. "This signature isn't yours," he said. It wasn't a question. He pointed out slight discrepancies in the writing, the pressure, the angle, details only a trained eye would pick up instantly. It was confirmation, spoken plainly and without hesitation. Then he opened his binder and slid a sheet my way. "We contacted local pharmacies," he said. "Your nephew visited one yesterday. He asked about this medication. He tapped the name of the same prescription my doctor warned me about. He wanted to Know how strong the dosage is and if there were different versions. A coldness moved through me. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just clear. Questions about insurance were one thing. Questions about heart medication were something else entirely. The detective watched my reaction carefully, but didn't push. He folded his hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. I'm going to be honest with you. You should not be alone with him under any circumstances. I nodded once. The clarity helped more than fear could. It told me exactly where the line was drawn now and how far things had gone without my noticing. The supervisor stood beside the detective, arms folded tightly, her concern plain, even though she tried to keep her expression steady. The detective straightened and pulled a form from his folder. Based on what we've seen, we're opening a formal elder exploitation case, financial and medical. His voice didn't rise. He didn't dramatize it. He simply stated the reality. Point of no return. He asked a few more questions, simple ones about my nephew's recent visits, the missing items, the inquiries made under my name. I answered each one calmly, focusing on what I observed rather than what I feared. When he finished writing, he closed his binder with a quiet click and told me he'd be in touch soon. After he left, the room felt heavier, but not confusing anymore. The danger wasn't vague now. It had a shape, a pattern, a name, and I understood, with a clarity I hadn't wanted but needed, that this wasn't a case of misplaced concern from a relative. It was a threat, and it wasn't going away on its own. He showed up the next afternoon without calling ahead. I saw him through the glass of the lobby doors before he even stepped inside. His posture was different, too quick, too alert, like someone trying to appear relaxed, but failing. When he spotted me sitting near the hallway entrance, his whole expression shifted into a smile that felt pulled together at the last second. "Uncle," he said, voice warm in a way that didn't match his restless eyes. "Thought I'd check in on you." I nodded, letting him walk toward me while keeping my hands folded calmly in my lap. The staff near the desk noticed him immediately. One nurse stood and pretended to straighten paperwork, though she didn't move far. Another lingered by the hallway door, pretending to sort charts. They didn't say anything, but their presence stayed close, the way people position themselves when they sense a quiet danger. My nephew sat across from me, leaning forward with unnecessary enthusiasm. "You've been thinking about the future, right?" he asked. "Long-term plans? Arrangements?" His tone was soft, but too direct. The phrasing didn't sound like concern. It sounded like someone checking the status of a plan they weren't sure was moving fast enough. "I'm managing," I said, keeping my voice even. I watched the way his knee bounced once, then stilled when he noticed me noticing. He shifted posture again, trying to look casual. "Good," he said. "I just want to know everything's taken care of." He paused, searching my face. "I can help with that, you know." The offer didn't surprise me, but the insistence behind it did. I kept my answers short, not giving him anything to grip. "I have what I need." He waited for more, some opening he could slide into, but I didn't give him one. His smile faltered at the edges. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket, sliding it halfway across the table as though it were a menu. "I brought something simple," he said. "Just a quick signature." The way he said it made the air tighten. He didn't push it toward me, but the implication hung there. I didn't touch it. I didn't look down. I kept my gaze steady on his face. "I'm not signing anything today," I said, quiet but firm. His jaw tightened for a second before he forced another smile. "You're always so cautious." The irritation slipped through the cracks before he caught himself. He tucked the paper back into his jacket with a controlled motion, pretending he hadn't expected anything different. But the stiffness in his shoulders betrayed him. The staff stayed where they were, pretending not to watch, but watching everything. It gave me a sense of solid ground beneath the moment, a buffer that didn't exist earlier in the week. My nephew leaned back in his chair, the restlessness returning. "You know," he said, "things are easier when family handles them instead of strangers." His tone was sharper now, polished with a hint of frustration. I didn't rise to it. I let the silence sit. The calm didn't feel weak. It felt necessary. He waited another moment before standing abruptly. "We'll talk later," he said. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't harmless either. He turned toward the exit, barely glancing at the staff as he passed. The supervisor approached as soon as the doors closed behind him. "The detective called earlier," she said quietly. "He wants to arrange a meeting with both of you here." With staff present, I felt the decision settle inside me. Not rushed, not emotional, clear. If I was going to confront him, it wouldn't be in a hallway or a quiet room with no witnesses. It needed structure, control, eyes in the room that could see what I already understood. "Set it up," I said, steady and certain. The time for preparation was over. The next step had to happen on solid ground. The private room they chose was small and quiet, the kind used for family meetings and difficult conversations. The blinds were half drawn, letting in a muted strip of afternoon light across the table. I took a seat beside the supervisor, and two staff members stood near the back wall, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to appear neutral. The detective entered last, holding a folder under his arm. My nephew walked in behind him, wearing a smile that didn't match the stiffness in his jaw. The detective sat down, placed the folder on the table, and opened it without ceremony. "Thank you all for being here," he said. His tone was steady, every word chosen with professional precision. He pulled out the first document, the life insurance form with the forged signature. He slid it toward my nephew. "You left this behind," he said. "We've reviewed the handwriting and recorded discrepancies." My nephew barely glanced at it before leaning back. "That's not mine," he said quickly. "Anyone could print that. He probably signed it and forgot." He gestured toward me without looking at me, a dismissive flick of his hand that tightened something low in my chest. I kept my expression still and let the detective continue. Next came the pharmacy inquiry report. The detective placed it on the table with the same calm motion. "You asked a pharmacist yesterday about this medication," he said, tapping the name. "You wanted to know the strength, dosage patterns, and how the pill reacts in certain conditions." My nephew lifted his chin. "I was checking for him," he argued, "trying to understand what he's taking. That's not illegal." His voice rose slightly, the edge creeping in. The detective watched him quietly, letting the silence settle before moving to the next page. The supervisor stepped forward, her voice measured. "He tried to access our staff-only records area," she said. "He said he needed to verify medical papers. We asked him to step back, but he lingered." She didn't embellish the story. She didn't need to. My nephew turned toward her, irritation breaking through the surface. "I was concerned about him," he snapped. "You people overreact to everything." The supervisor didn't respond. She simply folded her hands and stepped back. The detective then placed the final sheet on the table, a printed log from the care home's device history. "You used his tablet," he said plainly, "and searched for side effects of overdose on his heart medication." His tone didn't rise, but the weight behind the words filled the room. My nephew's face went still for a moment, the mask slipping just enough for the truth to show. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried to recover with a strained laugh. "I was curious," he said. "That doesn't mean anything." "It does," the detective said, "especially when combined with forged documents and attempts to change financial beneficiaries." My nephew's foot tapped once under the table. His breath sped up just enough to make his words sharper. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I was just trying to speed things up." The sentence fell out before he could catch it, raw and unfiltered. His eyes widened the moment he realized what he'd said. The detective leaned back, not triumphant, simply resolved. He closed the folder and stood. "That's enough." He nodded to the two officers waiting outside the door. They entered quietly. No raised voices, no commotion. My nephew stood abruptly as the cuffs were placed on his wrists. "This is a mistake," he said, but the fight had drained from his voice. He looked around the room, searching for someone to argue with, someone to blame. No one moved. The detective spoke with calm finality. "You are being detained for attempted financial and medical exploitation of a vulnerable adult." The door shut behind them with a soft click. The room went still again, heavy, but clearer than it had been in days. The next morning began with a quiet knock at my door. The detective stood there with the same steady expression he carried through the entire investigation. He explained, in simple, direct terms, that formal charges had been filed during the night. Elder exploitation, attempted financial manipulation, and forgery. There was no satisfaction in hearing it, just a slow, heavy understanding that the situation had crossed fully into the world of consequences, far beyond family disagreements or misunderstandings. After he left, the care home supervisor came in with 2 security staff. They weren't dramatic about it. They simply explained new measures that would be in place. My visitors would be screened more carefully. Certain areas of the building would require authorization. My room would stay logged every time someone entered or left. Their movements were subtle, but their presence felt protective in a way I hadn't realized I needed. They didn't treat me as fragile. They treated me as someone worth safeguarding. Once the room settled back into its usual quiet, I spent the morning securing everything tied to my name. I called the bank first. The representative confirmed the login attempts and helped me place a higher restriction on my account. Then I contacted my credit card company and requested a freeze. After that, I updated passwords, wrote down new codes on a single sheet, and locked it in the drawer where no one but staff had access. The steps were practical, almost routine, but each one tightened a boundary that should have been there long before now. In the afternoon, the social worker assigned to my case arrived with a folder of resources. She spoke calmly, explaining options without rushing me. We reviewed legal protections I could put in place, contact limits, formal notices, and documentation that ensured no relative could make changes without my verbal and written consent. She helped me draft a file outlining my preferences, the people allowed to speak on my behalf, and the ones who were not. When she asked if I wanted to formally exclude my nephew from any decision-making roles, I answered without hesitation. She wrote the request clearly, her pen moving with a confidence that steadied me. After she left, my doctor came by for a routine check, but stayed longer than usual. He reviewed my medication plan, made a few adjustments, and ordered additional monitoring over the next week. His tone wasn't alarmed, it was protective. "You're safe here," he said, "and we're keeping a close eye on everything." It was a simple reassurance, but the weight of it settled into a place I didn't realize had been clenched for days. Later, when the building quieted again, I sat alone at the small table in my room. I didn't try to distract myself. I didn't push the thoughts away. I let them come, not the dramatic kind, just the steady truth of what had happened. The hurt didn't come from the investigation or the forged papers. It came from the simple fact that someone I once carried in my arms had looked at my life and seen opportunity instead of family. The sadness ran deep, steady, but contained. It didn't drown me. It made things clearer. Before the evening meal, I retrieved the notebook from my coat and turned to the final page. I wrote a single sentence: "He has no place in my plans anymore." Then I closed it with the certainty that this decision would not be undone. I handed the necessary documents to the supervisor, confirming everything that needed to be updated. No shared authority, no implied trust, no space left for him in any future arrangement tied to me. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't revenge, it was protection, earned late but earned fully. In the days that followed, the building settled back into its familiar rhythm, but the way I saw things had changed. I found myself waking earlier, sitting by the window before breakfast, letting the quiet show me what I had missed before. Betrayal doesn't arrive with loud footsteps. It grows in the spaces where trust goes unquestioned. It hides in polite smiles, familiar voices, and small favors that seem harmless until they aren't. I had lived long enough to know people change, but I hadn't expected the danger to come from someone who once held my hand as a child. With every passing day, the truth sharpened in a way that didn't wound anymore. It clarified. People don't always show their intent plainly. Some step forward wearing concern, kindness, or duty, but the shape underneath doesn't match. I accepted that fully now. The nephew I remembered from years ago wasn't the man who walked through the care home doors this month. Those two versions didn't belong to the same life anymore. I rebuilt my routine slowly, not out of fear, but out of intention. I checked my own medication schedule each morning, marking the doses in a clean notebook. I arranged my files in a locked cabinet, keeping only what I needed nearby. The staff respected the boundaries without treating me like a fragile thing. They knocked before entering, updated me on every procedural change, and kept careful watch without hovering. Their consistency grounded me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. When I walked the hallways, other residents nodded the way they always had, unaware of anything that had unfolded behind closed doors. That normalcy steadied me. It reminded me that life didn't disappear simply because trust had been broken. It adjusted, reshaped itself, made room for caution without removing peace entirely. The social worker stopped by one afternoon with updated copies of my protections. She said quietly, "You handled everything exactly when you should have." Her tone wasn't congratulating. It was reassuring. A few hours later, the detective called to let me know the case was moving forward smoothly, the evidence solid and consistent. Even HR followed up, confirming that all my accounts were secured. noting how fortunate it was that the forged request hadn't slipped through unnoticed. Each voice added a layer of calm, not because I needed validation, but because it confirmed I had not imagined any of it. My doctor checked in again near the end of the week. He reviewed my vitals, asked about sleep, and reminded me that stress leaves traces even when we think we've pushed through it. But as he packed up his chart, he looked at me and said, "You protected yourself. That matters." His words landed simply and stayed with me. In the evenings, I sat outside on the small bench near the garden. The air was cooler there, and the quiet felt earned, not forced. I didn't replay conversations or wonder where things went wrong. I didn't try to understand his choices. Some answers are empty, even when you find them. Instead, I focused on what remained steady in my life, the parts I could control, the boundaries I could keep, the clarity I'd gained. I wasn't looking for forgiveness or reconciliation. Neither belonged here. What mattered now was the certainty that I could move forward without carrying the weight of what he tried to do. I had survived far more difficult chapters in my life. This one had simply reminded me to guard the parts of myself that others might see as opportunity. As the evening shadows stretched across the pavement, I breathed in the cool air and felt something settle in me. Quiet strength, steady and earned. Growing old wasn't the problem. It never had been. Growing old isn't the danger. Trusting the wrong people is.